week, as you know, we're starting something a little bit different. Next week, I will not choose the subjects of my sermons. That has been chosen for me by you, the people of St. Andrews. And I think you ought to know what a big deal this is to me. Because you see, in so much of what I do, in my position here at St. Andrews, I am responsible to other people. I have to answer to the session, to the presbytery, to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada for many of the things I do. But in one thing, my freedom is absolutely clear. Only I can decide what I preach about. That is my prerogative. Nobody can tell me what I have to preach. And yet I have chosen, freely of my own will, I've chosen to give that decision over to you next month. But that's next month. Today, for the last time for a month, I am entirely free to decide for myself what I'm going to preach about. And so you know what I've chosen to preach about? One of your suggestions. I have taken up one of the suggestions that one of you made, and I don't even remember who it was, as a subject for a sermon. Out of Egypt, I have called my son, what influence does Egypt have on the origins of Christianity? I found that to be a very interesting question. I suspect that many of you also found that to be a very interesting question. And if some of you didn't vote for it, I don't think it's because you didn't find it interesting, but rather because you may have felt that January wasn't the best time to deal with a question like that. That it's something that fits better a little closer to Christmas. Maybe, let's say, on the Sunday between Christmas and Epiphany. So I, of my own free will, have chosen to take up that suggestion today. And it is a deceptively simple little question. It refers to an event that is described in the Gospel of Matthew, of a visit of Jesus to Egypt when he was a child because his parents were hiding out there from Herod, the king, who wanted to kill Jesus. And the question is, well, what influence maybe does that have on Christianity? Because there's been a lot of speculation down through the centuries that maybe what Jesus experienced while he was in Egypt could have influenced the man that he became. For example, it has long been noted that ancient Egypt was famous for its magicians and its physicians. So many have wondered, is it possible that one reason why Jesus became so famous as a healer and wonder worker was because of skills that he picked up while in Egypt? Or is it possible perhaps that some of his great teachings were borrowed from the philosophers in Alexandria in Egypt, or from the priests at Karnak? Interesting, intriguing idea, but ultimately I'm afraid we're going to have to say there's probably not much to it. Because Matthew seems to envision a very brief stay for Jesus in Egypt. He says that the family returned to Palestine upon hearing the news of the death of King Herod. And we know when King Herod died. He died in the year 4 BC. And Jesus, who we know died, was crucified sometime between 26 and 36 AD, when Pilate was in Jerusalem. It seems very unlikely that Jesus could have been born much before, say, 6 BC. So, what Matthew is saying is that Jesus would have returned from Egypt before he was probably the age of 2. And it seems very unlikely that his formation was at all influenced by Egypt at that tender age. And besides, Matthew's not in the least interested in what Jesus might have learned in Egypt. It's pretty clear that the main reason why he even brings this up is because he sees it as the fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy. He says this happened in order to fulfill what was said in the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Now this, by the way, is something that Matthew does 5 times in his gospel. 5 times in the birth account. He talks about things that happened to Jesus that he says happened in direct fulfillment of something that was said in the Old Testament. 5 times. And in fact, Matthew does a lot of things 5 times in his gospel. Just to give you a few examples. Matthew tells us in the birth account that there were 5 dreams. Jesus is called the Messiah 5 times in his birth account as well. In the genealogy of Jesus, Matthew names, guess how many women? 5. As Jesus grows up, he goes on to preach 5 sermons as the gospel goes forward. So there are all kinds of 5s in the Gospel of Matthew that are not found in any of the other Gospels. This can't just be a coincidence. In fact, Matthew is doing this on purpose. He is writing these 5s into how he chooses to tell the story in order to teach us something about Jesus. What is he trying to teach us? He's trying to say to us that Jesus is the new Moses. Because in Jewish tradition, Moses was very closely associated with the number 5. Mostly because there are 5 books in the Bible that bear Moses' name. So Matthew's trying to make a point about Jesus by including these 5 prophecies. And so it's quite possible that maybe he included this one in order to make up the number 5. And in fact, he kind of seems to be reaching for this one. I don't know if you noticed this, but the Old Testament passage he's quoting from is the passage that we read this morning from the prophet Hosea. "Out of Egypt I called my son." And the thing about that prophecy is, it doesn't seem to be a prophecy of the coming Messiah, does it? I mean, pretty clearly, when you read that passage, the son that is referred to is actually talking about the entire nation of Israel. The coming out of Egypt, clearly talking about the Exodus in the time of Moses. Most people would look at that passage and see in it nothing in terms of a promise of what will happen to the coming Messiah, and yet Matthew saw that. So the question still remains, why did Matthew mention this little visit to Egypt? Because it's not all that convincing as a fulfillment of prophecy, and it seems unlikely to have influenced the man that Jesus became. Why did Matthew even think it was important enough to mention? Well, perhaps Matthew brings it up because he sees it as symbolic of another connection between Egypt and early Christianity. Because in fact, a lot of people who have studied the myths and legends and religion of early Egypt, ancient Egypt, have turned up all kinds of parallels between the stories of Egypt and the stories that we have of Jesus. Take, for example, the ancient Egyptian myths of the god Horus. I'll just give you a brief overview. In the ancient Egyptian myths, Horus, the god, is the only son, the only begotten son of the great god Osiris. Horus is born of a virgin. His mother's name is Mary, spelled M-E-R-I. Horus is born in a cave. His birth is associated in ritual, at least, with a manger, and his birth is witnessed by a group of shepherds. Even more significant, when Horus grows up and becomes a man, he is killed, he is crucified in fact, he is buried in a tomb. 3 days later, he rises from the dead. This story of Horus is well attested in the ancient scrolls and monuments of Egypt, and of course they well predate anything written in the New Testament. And so this has led some people to make the accusation that, in fact, the Christians, when they came along, stole the story of Horus and rewrote it as the story of Jesus. That it didn't really happen. They borrowed the myth and made it their own. It's an interesting idea. And that's what really piqued my attention when someone brought up this question, well, what does Egypt have to do with the origins of Christianity? Is there a connection? It's a question you can't help but ask when you look into it. Is there a connection? And so I did a lot of thinking and looking into these ancient myths and trying to find those connections, and I've come to the conclusion that ultimately, no, you cannot say that Christianity stole the story from Egypt. But you need to understand a little bit of what's going on there. Now, some of the connections between the stories of Horus and the stories of Jesus are simply coincidence. You can't explain it in any other way. For example, one of the parallels people have mentioned is, it says in the myths of ancient Egypt that the god Horus was almost killed by a man named Herod when he was only an infant. And a lot of people have seen in that, well, a parallel to Matthew's story of how Herod tried to kill Jesus by slaughtering all the children in Bethlehem. What about that? And it's true that some people could suggest that indeed Matthew could have made up the story of the slaughter in Bethlehem simply because the only historical account we have of that terrible crime against humanity is found in the Gospel of Matthew. You can't find it anywhere else in ancient literature, and so you cannot prove that Matthew did not invent it. But no one can possibly suggest that Matthew made up King Herod. King Herod was a very real, very well-known ruler in ancient times. And what's more, Herod really was the kind of king who would do the kind of thing that Matthew describes, who would not hesitate to order his soldiers to slaughter even infants if they stood in the way of his goals. In fact, he actually did order the slaughter of his own children when they got in his way. So even if it's possible that Matthew made up the event, there's no way that he possibly made up Herod. Very real person. So very clearly, I think the similarity between the names Herod and Herod is simply a coincidence. And yes, in some cases, some people who are pushing this idea that Horus' story was adopted into Christianity have taken a few coincidences and have sort of told the story in such a way as to play those up. That's part of what's going on. But that's not the whole explanation. It also has to do with sort of cultural influence, how stories were told and shared throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. For example, another parallel, one that I mentioned, is this idea that the god Horus was born in a cave. Many have seen in that a parallel to the story in the Gospels of Jesus being born in a stable or in a cave. And of course it is true that in Christian tradition, the birth of Jesus is often depicted as taking place either in a stable or in a cave. I mean, there's thousands of years of heart history of that very picture. But here's the thing. The stable and the cave are not found anywhere in the Gospels, are they? Yes, Luke does say that when Jesus was born, he was laid in a manger. And a manger could possibly be found in a stable or in a cave, but not necessarily. In that world, a manger could just as likely be found in an open field, or in the lower level of a house, where animals were often kept. But the stable, the cave, are not found in the Gospel itself. Now, what happened? Why did Christians come to this conclusion, well, that Jesus must have been born in a cave or in a stable? Well, I imagine it happened like this. As Christians spread throughout the ancient world, as they settled in various places, They heard stories, of course they did. And when Christians settled in Egypt, a place where Christianity was very early established, yes, they probably did hear stories of Horus and how he was born in a cave. And yet, quite possibly, they began to think of Jesus' birth along the same lines. It's just sort of a natural, cultural influence thing that happens. It's not some sort of mysterious myth-stealing process. So part of it is coincidence, part of it has to do with cultural influence across the various cultures in the ancient Mediterranean world. But you can't just explain away all of these parallels between Jesus and Horus in that way. There must be something else going on. And in many ways, in fact, I don't find it at all surprising that there are parallels between our salvation story, the story we tell of Jesus, and the story of a God like Horus. Because I know we like to think that our story of Jesus and what he did for us is special and unique, and it is. But in some ways, it is also a universal story. It is a story that people have been telling forever. In cultures, in myths, in religions, spread throughout the whole world. Why? Because it is the story that I believe God has been whispering to his people from the very beginning of creation. The story is not only found in myth, not only found in religion, it is also found in literature and in film. For example, take the Harry Potter series. Now, the Harry Potter series, the books, the films have been out long enough now that I would assume if you want to know how that story goes, you already have found out. So I don't think I'm giving anything away if I tell you that in the final book of the Harry Potter series, this is what happens. Harry Potter goes out and willingly dies in order to save his friends. He is taken and he is murdered by Lord Voldemort, who is the personification of evil. Harry dies. And then what happens? He is raised from the dead, he is resurrected, and it is revealed that by his willingness to go and die, that Voldemort, when he killed him, actually sowed the seeds of his own destruction. Now, if that is not a parallel to our story of Jesus and his life and death and resurrection and the victory over death that he wrought for us, I don't know what is. The parallels are clear. And yet I would not suggest, not even for a moment, that J.K. Rowling stole that story from the Christian Gospels. I don't think she did. I think instead what happened was that J.K. Rowling heard a story that God has been whispering to humanity. In every time, every place, every nation, every culture, right from the beginning. A story that, yes, became flesh among us in the very real life and death and resurrection of a man from Nazareth, but is a story that is even older than that. Older than Egypt. As old as humankind itself. God has been whispering that story to his people forever, because it is the story of our hope. God's care for a human race that has gone so far wrong, and how we bring salvation. So yes, there is a sense in which the story of Jesus did come out of Egypt. There's also a sense in which it came out of Greece and Norway and the Great Plains of North America. Cultures and religions and people and literature all over this world who clearly did not influence one another have told that story. That does not change the fact, though, that it was made real. It was made flesh in this person, Jesus, who did live among us, who died among us, who rose from the dead. Why? To bring that story to life once and for all, demonstrating God's grace, God's love, and God's salvation. Will you take a few moments in silent reflection?